we'll have the meeting. There we go. We'll have the meeting on our available via Facebook and our YouTube channel and our website. So, all right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our luncheon, Gar Byram luncheon series. My name is Sam Pedroza, and as I mentioned, I will be letting people in as they pop in, and then hopefully it won't be too disruptive. Just a warning to everyone that I did have to come to work today, and so I'm trying to run this off my iPhone. So far so good, but I probably just jinxed myself. Right, I think it's going okay. As always, it's my honor to introduce Chris, who's going to introduce our speaker. And as always, I was going to say that Chris has done a dynamic job in bringing us some really neat speakers and really helping us be an informed club and really up to speed on so many issues that are out there. So with that, Chris, I look forward to hearing what you have to say about our speaker. Welcome.
Okay, thanks for that introduction, Sam. So let me just be very brief. I invited Professor Sadhwani here because we have some redistricting going on. I mean, we've already done the districting for the city council, but with the census, the 2020 census, we'll need to make some adjustments to it. And the Claremont Unified School Board is also going through the process of breaking from an at-large system into a trustee district system. So they'll need to draw their districts as well. Professor Sadhwani is Assistant Professor of Politics at Pomona College. She's a Senior Research Fellow at AAPI Data. She studies Asian American and Latinx voter behavior, public opinion, and representation. She also serves on the 2020 Citizens Redistricting Commission, tasked with redrawing district lines for Congress and the state legislature. Now I present to you Professor Sadhwani. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Chris and Sam, for having me here and for the invitation. I have a few slides. I know there was a lot of interest in vote dilution, so I look forward to talking about vote dilution in fairly general terms and how that relates to some of my research. Before I jump into that, though, I should say that, you know, I'm here really in my capacity as a professor at Pomona College. I do, of course, serve on the 2020 Redistricting Commission. I just want to let you know that one of the key pieces is that I can't take any information on redistricting. All of that, if you have thoughts or ideas, you are welcome to submit that to the commission, and I can share with you at the end some ways to do that and some ways that you all could get involved. There's lots of ways for folks to be involved in the redistricting process, and we absolutely welcome and encourage that. But I'm really here today to talk more so about my research. It just so happens that there's a lot of overlaps between the kind of research I do and the kinds of considerations that we have when it comes to redistricting. And so if it's okay with you all, I have some slides prepared and I'll share my screen. I'm also noticing it's not a huge group, so I'm wondering if we could actually just, if it's okay with Chris and Sam, if we could go around and just do some quick introductions. I'd love to know, meet you all. I'm still new to Claremont, the Claremont colleges, and to Pomona, and would love to just know who all's in the room.
That's a great idea, Sarah. And as we do that, if you could check to make sure that you have the capability to share the screen off your computer.
Yeah, it looks like I can. Mm-hmm.
Oh, perfect. So I don't know what order we should go in, only because it's so weird to see it. What I see is probably different from what you see, but I'll start it off, and then we could maybe have others just kind of jump in and see if we could get a rhythm here. But I'm Sam Pedroza. I'm the president of the club, and really, as Chris said, I'm really interested in hearing what you have to say, because I was on the city council when we did go through our districting, and Peter Yao was my colleague when he had to resign in order to be on the redistricting citizens committee. So yeah, I'm really interested in hearing what you have to say. So welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, and on my screen, I'm second. I don't know if I'm second on everybody's screen, but I'm Chris Natiki. I'm the Vice President for Programs.
I'm second. I'm Karen Chapman Lenz. I taught elementary school for 34 years, mostly in Claremont. But that's a long time ago. I'm very old.
Full of life, though,
I'm-
full of life and wisdom, I'm sure.
I'm Mel Boynton. I'm nearly as old as Karen, and I'm a longtime member of the club. I'm also involved in several things in the community, including the United Nations Association. I'm a retired technology executive.
Awesome. Thank you. Does anyone else want to introduce themselves?
Okay, I'm Janice Elliott. I used to live in Claremont before moving to Upland, and I knew Karen back in the days. I'm on the Upland City Council, and we went to districts in 2017.
Great.
I'm Merrill Rain. I'm a retired professor, longtime resident of Claremont, longtime member of the Claremont Democratic Club. And I actually testified before the Redistricting Commission last time around. So it was a fun experience, very late at night, but it was fun.
Oh, very good. Very good.
Well, I'm Ricky Maslovsky. I'm as old as Karen, and I taught math at Cal Poly Mona. And you know, as a mathematician, I know something about partitions, but I'm interested in the politics of the partitions too.
Great. Oh, Bob, I think you're on mute, actually.
Oh, want me to go ahead?
You go ahead, Juan.
Okay, my name is Juan Matute, and right now I'm old and I'm very hungry. And I'm a 1963 graduate of Pomona College. I've been through a lot of auditing courses, particularly with Professor Williams and several other courses, very interested. But I've been a political junkie ever since I developed an extreme hatred for Richard Nixon back in the 50s and 60s. And I followed it all the way through, and I grew up in Redondo Beach. I did live for 24 years in the state of Georgia, so that's given me some perspective away from California, made me appreciate more of what is in California. And I'm back and moved back to Claremont. Well, I couldn't afford to move back where we lived before because I can't afford a home. So the next best thing was to settle in Claremont, and I enjoyed it all the time. And I belong to various little groups, and I like to drop in and listen to everybody.
Okay, I guess I'm next. I've been a long-time resident of Claremont, retired president of the Claremont Democratic Club many years ago, retired sociologist. My wife was a professor of psychology at Pitzer College before she retired 2 years ago.
Are you the Ivan Light that studies ethnic enclaves?
Yeah.
Wow, okay. I feel so small right now.
Okay.
Very good. Did we miss anyone?
Yeah.
I gotta tell you, I'm Bob Hughes, and we live in Claremont for about the last 5 or 6 years. I was a high school teacher, and I wrote the state exit exams for years and years. And my wife was a college trustee for about 17 years down in San Diego County, Escondido and San Marcos.
Oh, wow. That's great.
That's it.
Carol Lee?
Here.
I'm Carol Lee Monroe, and I'm the club secretary, recording secretary.
She does everything.
That's great. And then I think the last person is maybe Alfonso.
Yeah, this is Alfonso Castro, my wife Miriam. We live here in Claremont. I work for Harvey Mudd College. I'm a professor of mathematics. We've lived in Claremont since 2003.
Very good.
Carol,
Nobody got me.
Sarah, if I could just interrupt real quick and ask everyone if you could mute yourselves while Sarah speaks, and then we could do some Q&A after she's done. So we would appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah.
You bet. And I'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides prepared. Let's see. Oh, where's the full screen mode? There we go. So, I know that there was a lot of interest in vote dilution. So I'm going to talk a little bit about vote dilution first, but I'm actually going to center my talk today around a research project that a research project that I've had kind of in the works for a long time. I'm anticipating that it's going to be a chapter in the book that I'm working on, and that's looking at candidate choices in the 39th congressional district, which I'm sure you're all aware of is right up next to Claremont. Perhaps some of you have been involved in it. This is the race in the last couple of years that we've seen between Young Kim and Gil Cisneros. And how that relates to vote dilution is that I'm ultimately using the same kind of method, the same statistical method that's used in vote dilution. So I'm going to start off talking a little bit about vote dilution, and then move into more of the specifics of this project around the 39th congressional district. I have quite a lot of slides, so we don't have to get through all of them. We can glide through some of them kind of quickly. So I wanted to just start off knowing that there was the interest in vote dilution of talking about, well, what is it, right? So just a common definition. It's the use of redistricting plans or other kinds of practices that would minimize or cancel out the voting strength of racial or other minorities, with the effect of those communities ultimately being unable to elect their preferred representatives, right? So if you have a minority community, we would anticipate then that they should be able to elect the candidate of their choice. It's how we arrive at a commonly discussed term in political science, descriptive representation, those representatives who are really from the community and reflect and resemble the values of the community. In survey data, we often see reports that people want to see more descriptive representatives. They want to see more people from their communities being elected to office. In fact, I ran a survey this fall of Indian Americans. It was one of the first times that Indian Americans, a survey was specifically done of Indian Americans. I was very interested, I'm Indian American myself, and I was interested in the connection between the Indian American community and Kamala Harris as the vice presidential nominee. And what I found was that nearly 60% of the people surveyed, of Indian Americans surveyed, said, in fact, they do want to see more Indian Americans elected to office, even if they're from a party that's different from their own. So this desire to see one of your own, so to speak, continues to be very strong in many minority communities. Okay. When it comes to vote dilution, we're often thinking about it from a redistricting standpoint. Where there are various techniques used in redistricting that will lead to a situation in which a minority's community's vote is diluted. We often think about this as terms like packing or cracking. So packing meaning concentrating all of the minority community together in such a way that perhaps they get just one majority minority district and no others. We could think about cracking as cracking, putting fissures throughout a minority community that's otherwise geographically concentrated, so that they have no majority in any of the districts where large concentrations of their community lie, and that they would never be able to elect a representative of their choice. Neither one of these is perfect situations, obviously, for minority communities in terms of their ability to elect the candidates of their choice. Okay. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, this is federal law. It sounds like from the introductions, many of you are very familiar, of course, also with the California Voting Rights Act, which is somewhat different. We can talk about that also. But the 1965 VRA, Section 2 allowed for the creation of majority minority districts. and that plaintiffs can bring lawsuits with claims of vote dilution and seek remediation. So they can seek change from the court in terms of how their lines are drawn. And in 1986, in a key Supreme Court case of Thornburg v. Jingles, the Supreme Court laid out some of the key conditions that need to be met in order for the court to step in and require or mandate a redrawing of lines due to vote dilution. And they said first that, of course, the size and compactness of the minority group has to be sufficient, right? So if a minority group is spread out significantly, then there's not much to do in terms of remediation to create districts in which they can elect their chosen their candidate of preference. For example, here in Southern California, in the study of Asian Americans, we hear a lot about the need for outreach to the Pacific Islander community. And I think that is very true. There's a large and robust Pacific Islander community in Southern California. But unfortunately, the PI community is somewhat dispersed in the neighborhoods in which they live. So having a district, for example, that's concentrated with Pacific Islanders is not highly likely given that geographic dispersion. A second condition under the Jingles ruling was political cohesiveness of the minority group. In other words, can we assess, does this minority group actually vote as a bloc? Do they have shared preferences? And if not, then perhaps there isn't a need for remediation, right? If there's a lot of variation in terms of the kinds of preferences that they have, then there may not be a need for the court to step in. And finally, there also has to be evidence that the non-minority populations also tend to vote as a bloc, and ultimately they block the interests of that minority population. Okay. And where, my jumping off point for this is this second rung, right, around political cohesiveness. Does the community vote as a bloc? And to assess that, there's typically a test for cohesiveness and with the examination of racially polarized voting. And so ultimately what we're trying to assess here is using vote returns, trying to figure out, does a community in this district all have the same kinds of preferences? If we look over multiple election cycles, can we see that a minority community is consistently voting together to support various candidates or even ballot initiatives? And we do that through a Bayesian statistical analysis called ecological inference. And that's really my jumping off point. I feel like my role as a social scientist is that I can do this analysis. I understand, I can answer the question of, is there racially polarized voting? Yes, no. The question of, is there vote dilution, is really a secondary test, which in my mind is really a question for communities themselves and community advocates and VRA attorneys to ask and to answer and to advocate for. So this is kind of the jumping off point to some of my other research, specifically looking at the 39th Congressional District, in which I use this method of ecological inference, which is needed for understanding vote dilution cases, to look at the extent to which Asian Americans and Latinx voters constitute racially polarized voting communities. Okay. So that's my spiel on vote dilution. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the places where I've used it, and then we'll look a little bit at the 39th Congressional District. In California, I think there's a lot of places we can use it, especially because of our top two primary. It creates a situation in which we see races where you'll have two Democrats or two Republicans. And I think that creates a really unique opportunity to understand voting behavior. And so I've done a number of studies looking at these kinds of elections. This one was one looking at when a Latino is on the ballot. When there are two Republicans who arrive at a general election. And ultimately what I find is that Latinos, including Latino Democrats, are highly likely to support a Latino Republican over a Republican of a different racial or ethnic background. Similarly, I have a study that just came out looking at a similar phenomenon for Asian Americans in assembly district races all over the state, in which an Asian American Democrat is on the ballot against a Democrat of another race or ethnic background. And ultimately, I find that in all of those cases, there's evidence that the Asian American community constitutes a racially polarized voting bloc, in that they support Asian candidates. This is important. Asian Americans haven't been studied in great detail in terms of their voting behavior, and even the notion of what is an Asian American or who is an Asian American is still something that's very much contested and being discussed in the literature. Of course, when we use the term Asian American, we're typically referring to a broad array of people of different national origin backgrounds, from China, from India, from Vietnam, from Cambodia, from the Philippines. So there's a lot of pan-ethnic diversity within this scope of Asian Americans. So better understanding the extent to which Asian Americans, when aggregated, vote cohesively had until now been a missing part of the puzzle, which is kind of a big part of my fascination with further understanding Asian Americans. Similarly, I took a look at a race several years ago in Northern California in Congress between Mike Honda and Ro Khanna, both Asian American Democrats, both of different national origin backgrounds, and was able to look at the ways in which the Asian American community, this is the one Asian majority minority congressional district in the continental United States, and it was able to show the different ways in which different parts of the Asian American community kind of split behind with their support behind these two candidates. And what I wanted to talk a little bit more about today is the 39th congressional district. I wrote a piece several years back now, prior to the general election, actually prior to the primaries in 2018. And of course, if you recall, in 2018, it was the time in which there was a lot of talk of a blue wave, right? And we saw a number of districts flip from being held by Republicans to being held by Democrats. And that was the case for 3 districts in Orange County, including the 39th congressional district. I was really interested in Orange County because OC has seen an overwhelming amount of demographic change over the last 10 years. I'm very excited to see the census data when it comes out, because I anticipate that we've seen significant changes in Orange County's demography. The 39th congressional district in particular, but as you can see from this slide, all 3 of the key districts that flipped in 2018 have sizable Asian American populations in them. So if you go back to thinking about, vote dilution and remedies that the court can take, one of those components has to be size and geographic concentration. And one of the things that we see here is while Asian Americans certainly don't make a majority in any of these districts, they are significant proportions of the residents of these districts. So in the 39th congressional district, we can see almost 30% of the district residents are Asian American, while 34% are white, 32% Latinx, and a much smaller percentage is African American or Black. So in my research design here, I wanted to take a look at congressional districts over the course of many years. I went back to 2012, which was the first time that congressional district had been formed following the 2010 redistricting cycle. And so I looked at a whole host of congressional districts to better understand how do Asian Americans in this district vote, and what kinds of candidates are they supporting. I think that one of the things I forgot to mention in these 3 districts was that in all 3 of them in 2016, they sent back their Republican incumbents to the House of Representatives. So those incumbents won, and we can see their Royce, Walters, and Rohrabacher here. but Hillary Clinton actually led their presidential vote choice. So that said to me that either people were rolling off and not voting further down the ballot for the congressional election, or people were voting for Hillary Clinton for president, as well as for Republican incumbents to go back to Congress. So I wanted to better understand who was it that was voting for Hillary Clinton. Okay, and so I did this whole analysis of this district in particular. The data is all pulled from the statewide database. This is actually the redistricting database for the state of California. And ultimately, as I mentioned previously, I'm using the method of ecological inference, which is a way of estimating support for a candidate. These are, of course, secret ballot elections. No one knows how you voted, but looking at the precinct level, we'll take the total number of votes a candidate received and look at the percentage of a racial group in that precinct, and using inferential statistics, attempt to infer the support for a candidate by each racial group. And again, this is the method that's used in voting rights cases. I think one of the other key pieces of the story of the 39th congressional district is, while there is a large number of Asian Americans in that district, and we've seen Korean American Young Kim, run for office twice in that district now. Korean Americans actually are not the largest component of that district. Chinese Americans are, particularly in those regions of Rowland Heights and Diamond Bar and other parts that the district includes. So this is, to me, a key part of the story. When Young Kim initially announced that she was running in 2016, I think many people thought, okay, this is a story of Asians versus Latinos. That wasn't necessarily the case, right? Because within the Asian American community, there is still so much diversity in terms of national origin, and that has important consequences for political behavior. We can see here, this is just voter registration in the 39th congressional district. We can see Indian Americans and Latinos are more heavily identifying with the Democratic Party. Chinese Americans, the largest group of Asian Americans registered in the district, however, are largely identify as declined to state or having no party preference. This is a very common phenomenon amongst Chinese Americans in particular, and felt more broadly amongst Asian Americans as well. There's a lot of work for any party to do to really bring Asian Americans, Chinese Americans in particular, into the ranks of the parties. Regularly, Asian Americans report on surveys not being contacted by either party, having no contact to go out and vote. And to me, that's a clear misstep of some of the parties in their outreach work. So we're going to very briefly take a look at these findings. I know there's a lot here, so we're going to go through it systematically so that we can kind of understand what we're looking at. First of all, I just wanted to draw your attention to the rows and columns. So on the top, you can see the various communities that I'm estimating. So I have Asian Americans, Latinx, and then this other category of other. This constitutes all other voters in the district. As we saw from the district demographics, that's predominantly white voters. There was about 2% African Americans in the district. They are included in that other. It's very difficult using surname matching to pull them out. So I kept them all together for the purposes of this analysis. On the left-hand column of rows, you'll see each election year, and you'll see the candidates that I'm assessing. So for the most part, I'm looking at Congress, as well as the final box down here being the presidential race in 2016. If we start by looking at this other category, which again is predominantly white voters, but also includes some others, we'll see across the board over all 4 of the elections that I analyzed, the majority of these voters supported Republican candidates, right? So how we read this is an estimated 76% of these voters supported Royce in 2012, 79% supported Royce in 2014, etc. We can see that that number diminished somewhat in 2016 with 62% supporting Trump. So certainly we see that there's some voters that most likely were supporting the Republican incumbent Royce in 2016, as well as Clinton, because you can see a 10 percentage point difference between these two estimates. If we continue on, we can and look at the Latinx vote, we can see the reverse kind of relationship here. We see in the district across the board over all 4 elections, large percentages of Latinos in the district supporting Democratic candidates, 87%, 86%. Clinton receiving 93% of Latino support in the 39th congressional district. But when we pull back and begin to look at Asian Americans, we can see that there's a little bit more differentiation here. So in 2012, there was a Chinese American candidate, Jay Chen, who ran for office. And we can see that he received 62% of the Asian American vote in 2012. He ultimately didn't win that election, but notably, Asian Americans cast a lot of support behind Chen, the majority of their support behind a Chinese American candidate. In 2014 and 2016, we can see that the majority of Asian Americans supported the Republican incumbent Ed Royce, while at the same time in 2016, the majority supporting Clinton in her bid for the presidency. We can break this down further and look just at Chinese Americans. And here we can see the exact same pattern, but with even greater support for Chen. We can see 95% of Chinese Americans who cast a ballot in 2012, casting their support for Jay Chen. So then, of course, knowing all of this and seeing that this differentiation, particularly in 2016, I was very curious of what would happen in 2018 and 2020. Here we're just kind of pulling out Jay Chen in particular and seeing the key support that he was able to receive. So in 2018, of course, Royce announces his retirement, and the battle for an open seat is waged between Gil Cisneros, the Democrat, and Young Kim. Gil Cisneros, of course, wins by a very narrow margin in 2018. And so I wanted to ask, if there was, I think I'm missing one slide there. If there was competition or coalition between Asian Americans and Latinos. When I ran the analysis for 2018, I wasn't surprised when I looked at the others, that category of other voters, and we saw the majority there supporting the Republican candidate. That was completely on par with everything we had seen from all of the previous elections. Latinos, on the other hand, supporting the Democrat and also a Latino candidate. So we can anticipate that there might have been a greater tie, one of those descriptive representational ties that we might anticipate. But what I found amongst Asian Americans when I ran the analysis for 2018 is that despite the fact that Young Kim, as an Asian American, as a Korean American, was running, she didn't get the majority of the support of Asian American voters in 2018. In fact, the majority supported Cisneros. And with the breakdown of Chinese Americans, we can see an even greater proportion of Chinese Americans having cast their support for Cisneros. Of course, the same two candidates came to battle it out again in 2020. Young Kim came up the winner in 2020, again by a very slim margin. I'm awaiting that data so that I can run the same analysis to better understand what happened in the 2020 election, if Young Kim was able to make an appeal to Asian American voters to further pull them into her coalition, if Cisneros perhaps lost some of that support from Asian Americans, or perhaps even from others in the district during a presidential election year where turnout, of course, would have been higher. So it leaves me with a number of kind of findings here that in 2018, at least, Asian Americans and Latinx voters worked together as a coalition to flip this district. There could have been a Trump effect going on. I think there's a lot still to be seen with the 2020 election figures. And I think one of the pieces that I'm working on for my book, where this fits within a greater theory, has to do with cross-racial mobilization and the kinds of ways in which candidates of any background try to do outreach to different immigrant communities to bring them into their areas of support. I think there's a lot of opportunity, particularly amongst Asian Americans, to do that kind of outreach. And that's a big portion of the focus of my upcoming book project. So that's all I have for you. I have a little bit more on redistricting. If there's interest, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that. But for now, I'm going to stop the share, and happy to take any questions or have a greater conversation about any of this.
Excellent. And Sarah, I think we should let you just field the questions and eliminate the middleman. I think it'll be more efficient that way. So go ahead.
No problem. Ricky, I see your hand.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in the District 39 because, and I have one thing which might have fed into the discrepancy.
Yeah.
I was with Swing Left in 2018, and we did an awful lot of canvassing in District 39.
Yeah.
Now, by the time, I'm sure you've considered this, but by the time the 2020 election came along, we're in the middle of COVID, and Swing Left definitely did not go knocking on doors. I mean, there are other possibilities. I guess in the 2018 election, there were an awful lot of people, I guess in both parties, trying to get the seat. And I think that by the time 2020 came down, there was pretty much between Kim and Cisneros. But anyway, I do think that I'm happy to hear you talk about that, because I do have a stake in it because of my canvassing.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that those are the pieces that, especially for my book project, that I'm trying to pull in on. So perhaps we can even have a greater conversation about that at some point, because I think so much comes down to that kind of personalized one-on-one outreach to especially to new voting communities like Asian Americans. I think that there's a lot of opportunity to mobilize AAPIs, but organizations on the ground have that work has to be done. I think that is the moral of the story coming out of, for example, the state of Georgia, right, where we've seen mass mobilization of communities of color, not only African Americans, but also the large and growing numbers of Latinos and Asian Americans that also live in Atlanta and the surrounding suburbs. So this kind of mobilization is absolutely crucial. And I completely agree with you, Ricky, that I think that was a big part of it. My understanding, and I still have to do all of my interviews, but my understanding is that the Cisneros campaign didn't invest in the same way, hiring staff and doing the outreach to Asian Americans. And I would guess that may have been a major factor and played a major role.
Actually, most of the doors that my team group knocked on were Asian Americans.
So you helped to drive these numbers.
Oh.
Michael.
Yeah, I was going to follow up on Ricky's comment. I too was involved in the canvassing in 2018. And one thing that we found too was that there weren't as many locals in the district working with us as there were sister district people, you know. It took a while before we made some really solid connections, and we had some good people there that we worked with that knew the territory. But if I had to guess at a percentage, I would say it was about 80% people from outside of the district doing the canvassing. I could be wrong, and there are some good friends that I've made during that campaign who could probably better address that than I could, but that was my impression.
And I can imagine reasons why that might be the case, right? I mean, Ed Royce, as an incumbent, had that seat for many, many years. And I think often with an incumbency advantage, people don't necessarily need to get involved or don't tend to get involved. So yeah, I can imagine a number of reasons why that might have been the case. And I would be really curious to kind of hear more about you know, about also even the impetus of people from these sister districts to come and be engaged and involved and be a part of that canvassing work. Super interesting.
Ivan also has his hand up.
My question is this, today speaking to a national audience, Nancy Pelosi said that diversity is our strength, quote, diversity is our strength, unquote. Now, would you please comment on the truth value of that proposition? Is diversity our strength? And if so, why? Thank you very much.
I'm not sure in the context in which Nancy Pelosi was talking about diversity as our strength. I can say I don't believe diversity is destiny. I don't think that because there are diverse people, it will be, you know, for the taking of the Democratic Party or for any other party for that matter. You know, I think many people do assert that with changing demographics that would somehow necessarily support the Democratic Party. I actually don't believe that to be true. I think that if the Democratic Party wants diversity to work for it, the outreach, that canvassing, all of those components have to be there. And that the Republican Party could just as easily do that outreach. You know, I think that we saw that many years ago with George W. Bush and his push for compassionate conservatism and really making that call to various diverse communities. And I think at that point was making inroads prior to 9/11. And I think we could have a much larger conversation about that. So certainly I don't think diversity is destiny. Diversity is our strength. I mean, I do believe that. I do think that people of diverse backgrounds and diverse experiences are going to bring new ideas to the table and in any realm that we might be talking about. You know, so I'm not sure in what capacity she was speaking about diversity being our strength. It can be, but I think that also requires a real and authentic discussion and conversation about what it means to include diverse people into any kind of coalition. I hope that answered your question. I think it could be of course a much larger conversation.
Can I just want to answer to Mike's remark.
Sure.
I found that as the election grew nearer, there were more and more people out canvassing with us who were from the district. So I don't know whether we set a good example or whether people got anxious as it got closer, but there were a fair number.
Yeah. Or maybe there was even some training of trainers going on, you know, right? Like
I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Yeah. That more people were getting involved. Mm-hmm. I see Chris has a hand up and then Mel.
Yeah, so Sarah, I'm interested in this question about vote dilution, and I'll describe for you the background for my interest. When the city council decided to go to districts, it did so under the presumed soon to materialize threat of a lawsuit under the California Voting Rights Act. But the threshold question here was one that they skipped over, which was, does Claremont have racially polarized voting? And it decided not to conduct a demographic analysis that would have been necessary to answer that question. and it skipped right to the districting. I mean, the districting that occurred for the council districts, I think was a positive development regardless, because it lowered the entry cost of entering a race, you know. So instead of waging an at-large district, you could do it in a district, which is much more inexpensive. The school district made the same decision. Now the school district is going to be going into trustee districts. They'll be drawing those districts soon. But they skipped over the threshold question about whether Claremont has racially polarized voting. My question to you is this: what kind of data would be needed and can a layperson acquire that data to examine whether the city has racially polarized voting? And the reason I ask that question is that in addition, I think the main argument that the demographer gave was that whenever they've examined this question in other localities, they found racially polarized voting. And so the inference was that if it happens elsewhere, it's likely to happen in Claremont as well. An inference that I found unpersuasive. And then the other thing that happened was, I think the city as a whole has like 25% Latino population, and it's higher in Southern Claremont. But even when they drew the districts, whatever the percentage was in Southern Claremont, whatever it was, it went up by like 3 or 4 or 5%. It wasn't a majority minority district by any stretch of the imagination, which suggests that the Latino population is spread throughout Claremont. It's not concentrated. So anyway, so my question again was, what kind of data would we need to get to examine the question for Claremont specifically, and can a layperson acquire that data?
Yeah, sure. So in general, to assess racially polarized voting, you need vote returns. So all of the vote returns are available either, well, especially for local elections, through the county registrar's office. So that is available, and then you would have to run the actual assessment of racially polarized voting. In terms of the CVRA, you know, my understanding, and I'm not a lawyer, so you know, I want to just put that out there, that don't take anything I say as legally accurate, but my understanding of the CVRA is that threat of lawsuit is very real for cities, counties, school boards, because they would incur the cost of litigation, which can be very costly. And so therefore, for many cities, if there is any sense of a threat of lawsuit, it often makes more sense just to make the switch to the single member district system than to engage in a lengthy lawsuit. That being said, there is actually a lawsuit right now that would be probably of a lot of interest to Claremont, and that's Pico Neighborhood Association versus the City of Santa Monica. And so very similarly, my understanding of the case is that there's not a huge number of Latinos in the City of Santa Monica. They did go to court. The initial finding of the court was that indeed the City of Santa Monica had to switch to districts. They redrew the lines, and again, Latinos only comprised less than a majority, about 30%. Of a district. And in an appellate court, in an appeal, the appellate court said, well, that's so if Latinos don't reach the majority, then you don't need this remedy. That case is now before the California Supreme Court, in which they're going to take a closer look at this question of vote dilution and what that really means. What is the intent of the CVRA? As it pertains to vote dilution? Is it only if you can create a majority minority district that the CVRA is intended to be a remedy? That does not seem to be the intent of the authors of the CVRA. My understanding is they've actually filed an amicus brief on this point. And I think the other key piece that the court will need to think about is, what are the values, what are the benefits to minority communities when you're at a district in which there's not a majority, right? So when you're in what would be called an influence district, where you're not the decisive voice necessarily of the outcome of the election, but you're highly influential at 30%. That's no small component of the electorate. What are the benefits to the community in terms of being kept together as opposed to being more dispersed across other districts, or in an at-large system as the alternative would be? So that might be a case of greater interest to Claremont, because it sounds like there's a similar demographic realities. And so certainly that case is still pending, and definitely something worth keeping your eye on. And I'd be happy to come back and talk more about it once we have a ruling. Mel.
Thanks. This is a very interesting hour, and I appreciate your being here. I was trained as an economist, and I've watched with dismay in my lifetime. I'm now over 75. In my lifetime, the inequality growing in America and its implications for all things political. And both major parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, rely heavily on major donors. And so it's just a fact of life. Is there a part of your study of these election results and districting that is looking at inequality, rates of poverty, income? Is that part of drawing districts, or do these not? Are we focusing more on cultural backgrounds, party representation, race, and so forth?
Yeah, in this study that I showed you here, there's not as much consideration of income and equality or inequality as it may be. This is really just looking at preference of candidates in this study. I do have other work, however, that most certainly considers socioeconomic disparities. In particular, in my voter turnout work, one of the things that I hypothesize is that we'll see changes in voter turnout amongst different communities of color, based to some extent on socioeconomic status and that kind of income inequality. It's not, it's because I study race and ethnic politics, you can't escape, right, the realities of inequality between communities at a very bare minimum. I don't do a lot of public policy research per se, so it doesn't come into effect in quite the same way as some other research that it might in other research. Certainly, I know you mentioned redistricting. When it comes to redistricting, communities of interest are actually a key component that the commission will be thinking about and taking into consideration. For communities of interest, we rely on communities to tell us where their communities lie, and that could be based on socioeconomic status, on income inequality. It could be based on, our community is landlocked and locked between freeways, right? And those are some of the kinds of considerations we absolutely could be thinking about as we move into redistricting.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for that question. It's such an important one. Meryl?
Yes, this has to do with redistricting. It's a group of questions. How did you get on the commission? How many people are on the commission? When will the commission start functioning? When will the census data be in? And that sort of question.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm happy to talk about that. Yes, how did I get on the commission? I don't know. There were 20,000 initial applicants for a 14-member commission. There's 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 4 independents who serve on the commission. I'm a very proud Democratic member of the commission, so very happy to serve in that capacity. The process, the vetting process was lengthy. We had to write multiple essays, have letters of recommendation from community groups and others, as well as public comments. I suppose I should note that prior to academia, I actually worked in civil rights and social justice organizations in communities of color. So I worked at CHIRLA, the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights, and Asian Americans Advancing Justice. And so, in my application, I certainly leaned on many of my colleagues from that time period, to also bolster my application, I hope. I mean, they provided public comment and such. It comes down to a final vetted list by the state auditor's office. The state legislature can knock off, I think, 24 names in total. If they feel anyone would not be able to be impartial. I made it through that, and the final stage is the first 8 members are actually chosen with ping pong balls in lottery style. So they literally bring out the lottery balls and assign everyone that's left on the list a name. And that's how I was selected. I thought, oh my gosh, I've never won the lottery or a grab bag or anything like that in my life. So it was definitely my lucky day. And yeah, I'm happy to serve. It's one of those things I put my name in. I knew what I had heard was that it wasn't a very diverse list of candidates. So I thought, okay, well, maybe I have something to offer, and at least I can help diversify the candidate pool. And here I am. I'm sorry?
What is the work schedule for the commission?
We have been meeting aggressively. So we started, we were formally seated. I began in July after the ping pong balls. The full commission of 14 started in August, and we have been meeting to set up our full staff. We have a full office in Sacramento that will assist us with all of our outreach and bringing together all of that work. In 2010, the commission received over 20,000 submissions of community input. We anticipate that will be much greater this time around in 2020. We are actively hiring VRA Council for the Voting Rights Act, to help us figure out questions like vote dilution and ensuring compliance with the Voting Rights Act, as well as an outside litigation team and a demographer and professional line drawer to assist us in the ArcGIS component of the actual drawing of the districts. The census, of course, is deeply delayed. So in a normal year, we should have.
That was the move I thought of.
Yeah, so we should receive, typically in a normal year, receive census data April 1st. We're now not going to receive it until September 30th. So of course, our timeline is deeply delayed. We anticipate, however, by hopefully May or June, to begin going out and collecting and soliciting community input on communities of interest. So that's most certainly a place where you all can get involved. We have a full brand new website that you are welcome to go and take a look at, wedrawthelinesca.org. And on it, we actually this year have a brand new online tool where you can draw your community of interest. So it's a mapping tool where you can go in and say, okay, keep my community together, and here's where my community lies. So I would definitely encourage you to go ahead and take a look at that. When Chris originally reached out to me, we did not have protocols yet for doing community outreach. And so that's why I said, okay, I can come, but in my capacity as a Pomona professor, we do actually have some protocols now. We have a redistricting basics training that we can do. That training is available on our website. So you all can go through it yourselves, or you could request a commissioner to come and do the training for you, or a staff member, excuse me. So that is all available, and we look forward to having community input to that process.
Okay, so everybody, please join me in thanking Professor Sadhwani for presenting to our club today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and thank you for being flexible and being willing to go back and forth to find out what your limits were, and working with us so that you could appear. I really appreciate that.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
I'd like to turn things back over to Sam now, who will run the rest of the show, rest of the meeting.
Cool, Chris, thank you very much. And Sarah, thank you for that really cool presentation. And it's neat to see that so many of our members here had some connection to that race. I was making calls, and I know Gil pretty well. I work in the district, so now I met young Kim a couple of times, but now we're gonna have to work with her. But nevertheless, thank you very much for that, and thank you all for participating today. The only announcement that Meryl has an announcement, but I do want to remind everyone that we do have a meeting on the 29th in a couple of Mondays, and that's going to be with Mayor Tim Sandoval. And Meryl, you have other announcements?
Yes, I just want to remind people we're having a special executive committee meeting tomorrow. And if you haven't turned in your survey questions yet, please do so before it's too late tonight, so I can get them calculated by morning.
That's important because it's going to guide the direction of our club. You don't want to leave it up to us because we're going to screw things up. I'm kidding, man. Any other announcements out there?
No.
Yep.
All right, with that.
I have an announcement, Sam.
Yes,
Mel. As many of you have heard Andy Winnick speak on the results of the 2020 election, but in case you've missed that, he's doing it again for the University Club this coming Tuesday. That's the 16th at 1 o'clock. And if you'd like the link to that, we circulate that by email. So just email Mel Boynton. My email is melbourne.boynton@gmail.com, and I'll send you the link.
Awesome.
Tuesday at 1 o'clock.
Very good. With that, thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice weekend. Hopefully we'll see some of you or get your surveys in for tomorrow, and then and we'll see you on the 29th.
Right.
See you later.
Adios. Adios.